Hi everyone, welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is another March Mystery Madness video. In today's video, I am going to be putting Miss Marple as a detective up against Kinsey Milhone, and we're going to see what kind of detectives they are and how they investigate their cases. But first, I need to give you the answer to yesterday's My March Mystery Madness mind bender. The clue was, with this 1930 detective fiction book, a new genre was invented, and it inspired James M. Cain and Raymond Chandler. The answer is The Maltese Falcon by Dahsiell Hammett. I don't have a copy of this book to show you, so I'm going to insert a picture here. Stay tuned to the end of this video for the next My March Mystery Madness mind bender. So, Kinsey Milhone, professional detective in 1980s Santa Teresa, California, versus Miss Marple, amateur detective, elderly amateur detective from St. Mary Mead in England, from the 1930s to the 1960s. How do these two compare as detectives? What are their methods? How do they investigate? What are their interview techniques? So let's get into this. I'm going to give you some basic information about each, and then I'm going to read to you highlights that show their interview technique, their information gathering or legwork, and confronting killers. I found this to be a really interesting project when I was researching this, to compare these two detectives and how they work. I had slightly more information about Miss Marple than Kinsey Milhone. I was hoping to get a book from the library about Kinsey Milhone that would have helped with a little more information, but it didn't arrive in time. So we'll just go with what I have, and I found it really interesting. So let's start with Miss Marple. Miss Marple is an elderly amateur detective, like I said, from the small village of St. Mary Mead in England, and we have books of hers that start in the 1930s and go up until the 1960s. This elderly small village woman, she's lived in that village her entire life, is surprisingly worldly. She is an observer of human nature, easily overlooked, with a shrewd intelligence. She is unassuming. She expects the worst or always believes the worst in people, so is never surprised by human nature. She has specialized knowledge from growing up in this village and observing human nature. She loves to do parallels with village life. She will watch how a person behaves, or she will hear a story and then she will have a parallel story from village life. She does enjoy springing traps in order to solve a mystery. She does it in Murder at the Vicarage, 450 from Paddington, and The Moving Finger, and probably a few others. She gets a variety of people to investigate for her, to do the legwork for her that she can't do. She's extremely inquisitive. She keeps a lot to herself in an investigation. And she can tell lies. She's actually surprisingly good at lying when necessary. She doesn't just do it willy-nilly, but when necessary, she will tell a lie. She uses fluttering and flustering to conceal her true purpose. She was an independent woman competently running her own life. Rarely does she make a mistake, but when she does, she quickly throws out her old ideas and starts fresh. She has a lot of common sense. She believes strongly in justice. She sees herself as an avenger or nemesis. You see this especially in Murder in the Caribbean, Nemesis, and A Pocket Full of Rye. She is brave. Surprisingly, for being an elderly single woman, she is brave. She confronts killers And she is not afraid to confront killers when she needs to get to the truth and to ensure that justice is served. She is frequently underestimated. She disguises herself as unthreatening. She uses conversation and observation in her investigations. She does legwork herself at times, but usually that entails arranging casual encounters with people in order to get information. She uses duplicity. She is logical, but she is not a vigilante. She works with the police. So this is the type of private investigator, amateur sleuth that Miss Marple is. Then we have Kinsey Milhone. Kinsey Milhone is a woman in her 30s from Santa Teresa, California. Santa Teresa, I would say, is a small city, and her books are set in the 1980s. And she is a professional. She is a professional private investigator. That is her job. She is tough, smart, resistant, independent. She's a true investigator, willing to do the legwork. She is dedicated, loyal. She will do the research when necessary, and because it's the 80s, that means slogging through records down at the actual record office, slogging through phone books, down at the library. She will do the research necessary. She uses contacts to gain information. She questions suspects. She keeps track of her cases on index cards, and she likes to flip them around, reorganize them in order to help her reason through the clues in her case. She is brave and strong, and she also has a strong sense of justice. So let's get into some comparisons directly from the books. Let's talk about interview technique. So for Sue Grafton, I'm going to read a portion from A is for Alibi, where she is interviewing a suspect, or a person anyway, who is connected to the case. Do you think it would distress the kids if I talked to them? Gwen was startled at that. The first time she'd seemed disconcerted by anything. About their father? I may have to at some point, I said. I wouldn't like to do it without your knowledge, but it might really help. I suppose it would be all right, she said, but her tone was full of misgivings. We can talk about it later. It may not be necessary at all. Oh, well, I don't see how it could hurt. I must say I don't really understand why you're into this business again. To see if justice was done, I guess, I said. It sounds melodramatic, but that's what it amounts to. Justice to whom? Lawrence or Nikki? Maybe you should tell me what you think. I'm assuming there was no love lost between you and them, but do you think he got his just desserts? Sure, why not? I don't know about her. I figure she had a fair trial, and if that's the way it came out, well, she must have done it. But there were times I'd have done it myself if I had thought of some way. So if she killed him, you wouldn't blame her? Me and half a dozen others. Lawrence alienated a lot of people, she said carelessly. We could have formed a club and sent out a monthly newsletter. I still run into people who sidle up to me and say, "Thank goodness he's dead." Literally, out of the corner of their mouths. Gwen laughed again. I'm sorry if that sounds irreverent, but he was not a nice man. But who in particular? She put her hand on her hip and gave me a jaded look. If you got an hour, I'll give you a list, she said. I laughed then. Her humor seemed irrepressible, or maybe she was only feeling ill at ease. Talking to a private eye is often unnerving to people. So that's Kinsey Milhone. Here is Agatha Christie in A Murder is Announced. She is talking to people who are involved in the case, in the murder. If Letitia Blacklock seemed slightly absent-minded when Miss Harmon came to tea and brought a guest who was staying with her, Miss Marple, the guest in question was hardly likely to notice the fact, since it was the first time she had met her. The old lady was very charming in her gentle, gossipy fashion. She revealed herself almost at once to be one of those old ladies who have a constant preoccupation with burglars. "They can get in anywhere, my dear," she assured her hostess. "Absolutely anywhere nowadays. So many new American methods. I myself pin my faith to an very old-fashioned device, the cabin hook and eye. They can pick locks and draw back bolts, but a brass hook and eye defeats them. Have you ever tried that?" "I'm afraid we're not very good at bolts and bars," said Miss Blacklock cheerfully. "There's nothing really much to burgle." "A chain on the front door," Miss Marple advised. "Then the maid need only open it a crack and see who is there, and they can't force their way in." "I expect Mitzi, our Middle European, would love that." "The hold-up you had must have been very, very frightening," said Miss Marple. "Bunch has been telling me all about it." "I was scared stiff," said Bunch. "It was an alarming experience," admitted Miss Blacklock. "It really seems like Providence that the man tripped himself up and shot himself. These burglars are so violent nowadays. How did he get in?" "Well, I'm afraid we don't lock our doors much." "Oh, Letty," exclaimed Miss Bunner, "I forgot to tell you the inspector was most peculiar this morning. He insisted on opening the second door. You know, the one that's never been opened, the one over there. He hunted for the key and everything and said the door had been oiled, but I can't see why, because—" Too late she got Miss Blacklock's signal to be quiet and paused open-mouthed. "Oh, Lottie, I'm so sorry. I do beg your pardon, Letty. Oh dear, how stupid I am." "It doesn't matter," said Miss Blacklock, but she was annoyed. "Only I don't think Inspector Craddock wants that talked about. I didn't know you had been there when he was experimenting, Dora. You do understand, don't you, Mrs. Harmon?" "Oh, yes," said Bunch. "We won't breathe a word, will we, Aunt Jane? But I wonder why he—" She relapsed into thought. Miss Bunner fidgeted and looked miserable, bursting out at last. "I always say the wrong thing. Oh dear, I'm nothing but a trial to you, Letty." Miss Blacklock said quickly, "You're my great comfort, Dora. And anyway, in a small place like Chipping Claygorn, there aren't really any secrets." "Now that is very true," said Miss Marple. "I'm afraid, you know, that things do get round in the most extraordinary way. Servants, of course, and yet it can't only be that, because one has so few servants nowadays. Still, there are the daily women, and perhaps they are worse, because they go to everybody in turn and pass the news around." "Oh," said Bunch Harmon suddenly, "I've got it. Of course, if that door could open too, someone might have gone out of here in the dark and done the hold-up. Only, of course, they didn't, because it was the man from the Royal Spa Hotel. Or wasn't it? No, I don't see after all," she frowned. "Did it all happen in this room then?" asked Miss Marple, adding apologetically, "I'm afraid you must think me sadly curious, Miss Blacklock, but it really is so very exciting, just like something one reads about in the paper. I'm just longing to hear all about it and to picture it all, if you know what I mean." So very interesting, the differences there in interviewing technique. So Kinsey Milhone is on the case. She has been hired to do it, and so she just comes out with her questions and asks what she wants to ask. Miss Marple, however, is an amateur sleuth who has not been hired to do anything, and she, you know, is more than happy to let people think that she is just gossipy and interested in burglars, and she just comes out with these comments and questions that will encourage further conversation and give her the information that she's looking for. As far as information gathering or legwork, I am going to read again from A is for Alibi for Kinsey Milhone. How does she gather the information she needs, or does the legwork that she needs? I went into the office early to type up my initial notes for Nikki's file, indicating briefly what I'd been hired to do and the fact that a check for $5,000 had been paid on account. Then I called Charlie Scorsoni's office. His secretary said he had some time free mid-afternoon, so I set up an appointment for 3:15 and then used the rest of the morning to do a background check. When interviewing someone for the first time, it's always nice to have a little information up your sleeve. A visit to the county clerk's office, the credit bureau, and the newspaper morgue gave me sufficient facts to dash off a quick sketch of Lawrence Fife's former law partner. Charlie Scorsone was apparently single, owned his own home, paid his bills on time, did occasional public speaking stints for worthy causes, had never been arrested or sued, in short, was a rather conservative middle-aged man who didn't gamble, speculate on the stock market, or jeopardize himself in any way. I caught glimpses of him at the trial, and I remembered him as slightly overweight. His current office was within walking distance of mine. So she does the research. She goes to all the different offices in order to get the information that she needs. and then here's another example. I stopped in at the credit bureau again and talked to my buddy who lets me peek into files not ordinarily made public. I asked him to see what he could find out about Sharon Napier, and he said he'd get back to me. I did a couple of personal errands and then went home. It had not been a very satisfying day, but then most of my days are the same. Checking and cross-checking, filling in blanks, detail work that was absolutely essential to the job, but scarcely dramatic stuff. The basic characteristics of any good investigator are a plodding nature and infinite patience. Society has inadvertently been grooming women to this end for years. I sat down at my desk and consigned Charlie Scorsone to several index cards. It had been an unsettling interview, and I had a feeling I wasn't done with him. So, legwork for Miss Marple looks a little bit different. This is a pocket full of rye. An elderly lady traveling by train had bought 3 morning papers, and each of them, as she finished it, folded it and laid it aside, showed the same headline. It was no longer a question now of a small paragraph hidden away in the corner of the papers. There were headlines with flaring announcements of triple tragedy at Yew Tree Lodge. The old lady sat very upright, looking out of the window of the train, her lips pursed together, an expression of distress and disapproval on her pink and white wrinkled face. Miss Marple had left St. Mary Mead by the early train, changing at the junction and going on to London, where she took the Circle train to another London terminus and thence on to Baden Heath. At the station, she signaled a taxi and asked to be taken to Yew Tree Lodge. So charming, so innocent, such a fluffy and pink and white old lady was Miss Marple that she gained admittance to what was now practically a fortress in a state of siege far more easily than could have been believed possible. Though an army of reporters and photographers were being kept at bay by the police, Miss Marple was allowed to drive in without question. So impossible would it have been to believe that she was anyone but an elderly relative of the family. Miss Marple paid off the taxi in a careful assortment of small change and rang the front doorbell. Crump opened it, and Miss Marple summed him up with an experienced glance. A shifty eye, she said to herself, scared to death, too. Crump saw a tall elderly lady wearing an old-fashioned tweed coat and skirt, a couple of scarves, and a small felt hat with a bird's wing. The old lady carried a capacious handbag, and an aged but good quality suitcase reposed by her feet. Crump recognized a lady when he saw one, and said, "Yes, madam," in his best and most respectful voice. "Could I see the mistress of the house, please?" said Miss Marple. Crump drew back to let her in. He picked up the suitcase and put it carefully down in the hall. So again, interesting differences in how they do the legwork or gather information. And then finally, I want to do a comparison of each of these detectives, investigators, confronting killers. Kinsey Milhone confronts a killer in F is for Fugitive. Now this might be a little bit spoilery because she is confronting the killer, but I will not name the killer. If the name is written there, I'm just going to use a pronoun instead, or just say killer, so that hopefully it doesn't spoil it for you if you haven't read it yet. I flashed the penlight through her living room and kitchenette, doing a 180 turn. When the narrow beam crossed the bedstead, I caught an oval of white and flashed the light back over it again. She was propped up in bed watching me, Her face was dead pale, her eyes enormous, so filled with lunacy and hate that my skin crawled. I felt as if I'd been pierced with an icy arrow, the chill spreading from the core of my body to my fingertips. In her lap, she held a double-barreled shotgun, which she raised and pointed right at my chest. Probably not rock salt. I didn't think the spider story was going to work with her. "Finding everything you need?" she asked. I raised my hands just to show I knew how to behave. "Hey, you're pretty good. You almost got away with it." Her smile was thin. "Now that you're wanted, I can do it, don't you think?" she said conversationally. "All I have to do is pull the trigger and claim trespass." "And then what?" "You tell me." I hadn't quite worked the whole story out, but I knew enough to make a flying guess. Why you have chats with killers in circumstances like these is because you hope against hope you can 1. Talk them out of it, 2. Stall until help arrives, or 3. Enjoy a few more moments of this precious commodity we call life, which consists in large part of breathing in and out. Hard to do with your lungs blown out your back. "Nobody's going to get in my way, Kinsey, not after all I've been through. I've worked too hard and waited too long. I've sacrificed my entire adult life, and you're not going to spoil things now that I'm almost free." "Well, listen, if I may say so, you're as crazy as a bug. No offense, but you are Looney Tunes, completely cuckoo nuts. I was just making mouth noises while I thought about my gun. My little Davis was still in the holster, tucked up against my left breast. What I wanted to do was take it out and plug her right between the eyes, or someplace fatal. But here's the way I figured it. By the time I reached up under my turtleneck, snatched the gun out, pointed it and fired, that shotgun of hers would have taken off my face. And how was I going to get the gun, feign a heart attack? I didn't think she'd fall for it. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and since I could see her perfectly, I had to guess that she could see me as well." So that's Kinsey confronting a killer. Miss Marple confronts a killer of her own in Sleeping Murder. And again, I am going to try not to reveal the name of the killer, so I will try not to be too spoilery here. Gwenda retreated before him, slowly, the scream frozen in her throat. She had screamed once. She could not scream again. And if she did scream, no one would hear, because there was no one in the house. Not Giles and not Miss Cocker, not even Miss Marple in the garden. Nobody. And the house next door was too far away to hear if she screamed. And anyway, she couldn't scream, because she was too frightened to scream, frightened of those horrible reaching hands. Maybe these ones. She could back away to the nursery door, and then those hands would fasten round her throat. A pitiful little stifled whimper came from between her lips, and then suddenly the killer stopped and reeled back as a jet of soapy water struck him between the eyes. He gasped and blinked, and his hands went to his face. "So fortunate," said Miss Marple's voice, rather breathless, for she had run violently up the back stairs, "that I was just syringing the green fly off your roses." So you get elderly Miss Marple, who is willing to run up the stairs and confront the killer. So anyway, that was Miss Marple versus Kinsey Milhone. Do you have a preference? Who is your favorite detective / investigator? That was just a fun little one against the other, let's say. So here is the Mind March Mystery Madness Mindbender. A prolific writer from the Golden Age broke from her typical pattern and wrote one historical mystery. What was it called? So put your answers down in the comment section down below, and I will see you tomorrow for another March Mystery Madness video. Bye.